Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to Victober. It is Victober. I'm very excited for a month of Victorian literature, and I hope that you are too. So today is the 1st of October, it is Victober time, Victober starts today. I'm going to be reading Victorian literature for the whole month. I know a lot of other people are too. I'm very, very excited. So I thought I would kick off Victober with telling you some of the reasons why I love Victorian literature. So I have 13 reasons today why I love Victorian literature. Basically I tried to write a list of 10 and there were more than 10 reasons. I mean there were more than 13, but you know, these are just 13 main reasons why I really, really love Victorian books. The first reason is the historical context. I really find the Victorian period a fascinating time in history. It's just absolutely fascinating. 19th century British history as a whole is like my favourite thing to learn about, but especially the Victorian period is just truly fascinating. Like the social and cultural, the political, economic, industrial changes that were happening over the 19th century in Britain are just absolutely fascinating and something I love learning about, especially through literature. I love how reading Victorian literature just shines a light on this historical period that I'm absolutely fascinated by. I love learning about Victorian history through Victorian literature, and also I love how learning about Victorian history impacts the way I understand and interpret Victorian literature. And I just think the history around that time period is so fascinating that I'm always going to find something to be interested in Victorian literature, because even if I read a Victorian book that I don't really like as a book, I'm always going to find it really interesting as a historical source because I find the Victorian period so interesting. So that's definitely a reason why I love Victorian literature. Another reason why I love the Victorian literature is because I really do think of the Victorian period as the birth of the modern novel within the English language. And obviously there were plenty of novels that were published before the Victorian period. I love Jane Austen, and while I don't love 18th century novels, I have enjoyed some of them, but I always think of the Victorian period as the time where the novel is coming into what it is today in Britain. When I read novels from before the Victorian period, they feel like they have less in common with today's books than Victorian books do, in terms of plot structures and how they work, in terms of exploring different perspectives and narrative voices and narrative techniques. So much of Victorian novel writing and storytelling is quite innovative in a really interesting way, and I feel seeing how literature changes and expands over the Victorian period is really, really fascinating. And the Victorian period really was the age of the novel. Before the Victorian period, poetry was really popular as well and read as much, if not more, than novels. And novels were considered quite lowbrow and a bit trashy. But actually in the Victorian period, the novel kind of came into its own as the most popular form of literary entertainment. And I just love seeing how the novel grew over the Victorian period. And I feel because of this kind of new interest in the novel as a form, there are just so many amazing novels that came out of the Victorian period, which I love. Number 3 has to be the beautiful writing. I love Victorian writing. I love the writing style of the Victorians so much. And obviously many Victorian writers write in many, many different styles, but in general, I really enjoy the writing style in Victorian novels. There's only 1 or 2 Victorian writers whose writing style I don't get on with. And in general, I find Victorian writing so beautiful and so interesting. And yes, it can be a little bit long, and yes, it can be a little bit intense, but I love that about it. I love the quirky imagery and the winding sentences of Dickens. I love the wry wit of Anthony Trollope, or the kind of flowing, lovely writing of Elizabeth Gaskell, or the kind of beautiful descriptions of Thomas Hardy. I love how the Victorians write so much, and I love the energy and attention that is put into their writing so much. Number 4 is characterization and character development. Obviously this varies between Victorian literature, but I really love how so many Victorian writers create these really, really rich characters, whether these are the kind of realist characters you find in Gaskell, or the much more kind of over-the-top exaggerated characters you sometimes find in Charles Dickens. And another thing that I love about Victorian characterization is how much a focus there is on character development. One thing I always find when I read books from before the Victorian period, and with the exception of Jane Austen, is that that there isn't that much character development, and often characters are quite like static throughout the whole novel, whereas the Victorian period I feel like is really concerned with character development and character arcs. There are a lot of like coming of age stories that come out of the Victorian period, and a lot of tales of characters kind of changing over time, which I really, really love and is something I just thoroughly enjoy. The fifth reason why I love Victorian literature is that in general Victorian novels look at like all of my favourite themes. When I say all of my favourite themes, to name a few would be like gender, class, industrialisation and social change, family, urban versus rural life, like supernatural versus science stuff, religion versus science, you know, growing up. So many themes in Victorian literature that I love. Obviously gender and like the exploration of gender is a big thing for me, and because how people understood gender changed a lot over the Victorian period, that is something I think I really love in Victorian literature and find really fascinating in Victorian literature. I feel like one of the things I will always find incredibly fascinating in Victorian literature is Victorian exploration of and ideas of gender. That's something I always go back to again and again when I'm reading Victorian literature, something I always look out for. But in general, beyond that, there are just so many themes in Victorian literature that I love and which I find absolutely fascinating. Leading on quite nicely from that, reason number 6 is social criticism. I really love how many Victorian books are social critiques, how many Victorian books are like condition of England novels that are really examining the problems of society, picking them apart and suggesting solutions. Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, Thomas Hardy, George Gissing, and so many more. Like there are so many Victorian authors which are really picking apart social problems in a way that I just love. It's something I adore about Victorian literature, which I feel like you don't get that much of in modern books. It's just something I completely love about Victorian books. Another thing I love about Victorian literature is the plots. I love how many really long Victorian novels have really complicated plots and lots of different subplots that all interweave together in the most amazing way. I love the plotting of Victorian books and how story driven so many of them are. Like how many of them have these complicated, amazing plots, whether it's love stories or crime stories or, you know, the crazy sensationalist plots you get in Mary Elizabeth Braddon or Wilkie Collins. Like I love the plotting of Victorian books, and especially in those kind of like big chunky books by Charles Dickens or Anthony Trollope, how they all weave together in the most amazing way. Another thing I really love about the plots of Victorian books is that often like the premise of the plot is not like set up from the beginning. I feel like we have this obsession within contemporary fiction with kind of getting right into the story and like the premise has to be there on page 1. And I know I'm guilty of this when I read contemporary literature myself, and you know I work in publishing and I know I am guilty of reading a book and feeling that it doesn't get into the story right away. But one thing I kind of love about Victorian literature is that often like what the premise of the book is doesn't emerge until chapter 10 or even halfway through, and sometimes you can read a story and you think it's going in one direction and suddenly everything just completely changes, and the kind of dynamics and the goalposts of the book and the aims of the book just completely change. Often when I talk about a Victorian novel and I'm trying to explain what it's about, I find it really hard to explain what it's about without referencing an event that happens in like chapter 10, and I kind of love that. Like I love that Victorian literature lets itself set up and lets itself get into the story slowly, and that you don't always know what's going to happen. I completely love that about Victorian literature. It's definitely one of my favourite things. Reason number 8 why I love Victorian literature is the balance of all of the things I've just been talking about. I love within Victorian literature how you have that balance of beautiful writing with complicated characters who go through character arcs, with fantastic themes that are truly fascinating, and wonderful plots. I know I've spoken about this before on this channel, but I do sometimes find in contemporary fiction that the books that have the most beautiful writing, where I love the writing the most, often nothing happens. And one thing I love about Victorian literature is how there are books that have intensely beautiful writing and wonderful characterization and fascinating themes, but also have a really good story. That is like the main thing, the thing I really love about Victorian literature. Another thing I really enjoy about Victorian literature is that Victorian novels often have quite neat endings. It's not to say that I always like a neat ending. Sometimes a really open-ended ending can work really well, but there's something really satisfying sometimes about books which tend to end in marriage or death, or like a character having a really important realization about themselves. And don't get me wrong, some of my favorite Victorian books are the ones that don't have neat endings, that don't end in marriage or death, that subvert the kind of of Victorian expectations. But at the same time, sometimes there's something really satisfying about a book which ties everything up in the end. And one thing I love about Charles Dickens is that sometimes there'll be like a whole 8 chapters which are like tying up all the loose ends at the end. And it's really, really satisfying because you get to know everything that's happening to everyone in a really wonderful way. Reason number 10, another thing I love in Victorian literature is the love stories. So many of my favourite love stories of all time are from Victorian literature. So many fantastic Victorian novels have these amazing sweeping love stories that are so compelling and so wonderful. North and South, or Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, are 2 of my favourite love stories of all time, but I also love the love stories in Our Mutual Friend, in Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, in Jude the Obscure and Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, in The Tenant of Welfare Hall by Anne Bronte, in The Netherworld by George Gissing. Whether these are happy love stories or sad love stories, they're so good. And the Victorians, I think, just wrote amazing love stories. I also feel like the kind of like social structures of the Victorian period and all the rules of like propriety and etiquette make for, to be honest, probably bad relationships at the time, but really, really good love stories. So I really enjoy that as well. Reason number 11 why I love Victorian literature is the humour. I find Victorian literature absolutely hilarious. I have a very 19th century sense of humour, and Charles Dickens to me is the epitome of what is entirely funny. And I know that not everyone agrees, but for me, I can find so much hilarity in a Dickens book. There are so many other Victorian writers who I find really funny as well. Writers like Anthony Trollope, or Jerome K. Jerome, or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or Edward Lear, or George Grossmith. Even like Jane Eyre, which in general I would say is not an incredibly funny book. Some of that dialogue is just really, really makes me giggle in such a wonderful way. There is just so much Victorian literature that I find absolutely hilarious. I have such a Victorian sense of humour, and the kind of wit of the Victorian novel is just something I adore. The 12th reason why I love Victorian literature is its staying power and rereadability. There are so many Victorian books which I could read again and again and again and again and still get so much out of. I often get even more out of a Victorian novel on a reread. I find Victorian literature so rereadable, and a rereading experience of Victorian books so enjoyable. But also, even without rereading, I find that Victorian novels have a really like big staying power for me, and that often I can have read a Victorian novel a while ago and it still has stuck in my head a lot, and it still has really, really stayed with me. In general, I would say the books I have the most like urge to reread tend to be Victorian novels that I haven't read for a while, because they have stayed with me so much and made a really big impact on me, but I also want to rediscover them because I think they have really good rereadability as well. And the 13th and final reason why I love Victorian literature is because I just do. And let me explain that a little bit more. One, I mean like all of the reasons above and so much more, but also I mean that because I love Victorian literature, I have read quite a lot of Victorian literature. And because I've read quite a lot of Victorian literature, I love Victorian literature. Because the more Victorian literature I read, the more I understand the Victorian period, and the more I learn about the Victorian period, which means the next Victorian novel I read or reread, I have extra context and knowledge to bring to that reading, which means that I love it all the more. Like, I feel like having read a lot of Victorian literature means I appreciate every Victorian novel I read even more than I would have done like 100 books ago. And so it's kind of a like self-fulfilling prophecy and a bit of a like cycle, in that I read Victorian literature, therefore I know about Victorian literature, therefore I love Victorian literature, therefore I read Victorian literature, and it just carries on going in a snowball. Like, I feel like there are probably other periods in history and other periods in literature that I could find possibly just as, but certainly nearly as interesting as I find the Victorian period, but I find the Victorian period the most interesting because I've read the most books from it, so I know the most about it. So that means I can interpret Victorian books differently and more, but also it means I can like appreciate a subverted Victorian novel more. So for example, some of my favourite Victorian books are Victorian books that like take Victorian tropes and turn them on their heads, or like do really interesting things with the form of the Victorian novel, or that like take what your kind of Victorian reader expectations would be and change them, or that are like really, really feminist for the Victorian period, though looking back on them now, we might not see how feminist they are, but because I have read lots of other Victorian books, I can see how feminist or proto-feminist they are, and I can see how subversive a particular book is, or how a book plays with form in a different way. Basically, what I'm saying is that I love Victorian literature because I love it, and the more I love it, the more I read it, and the more I read it, the more I love it, so the more I love it, the more I love it. Those are 13 main reasons why I love Victorian literature. As you can tell by my general excitement in this video, I really love Victorian literature. So that is all for now. Let me know down in the comments why you love Victorian literature, if you do. And if you don't, then, you know, please try some because it's amazing. That is all for today. Happy Victober. I am excited. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.